My chest. It hurts. Ah,
What's happening to him?
oh my God.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Vanished Lands. Some stories whisper at the edges of history, waiting for those curious or foolish enough to listen. This is one of them. A tale that begins with something ordinary, an antique wine cabinet, and unravels into something far darker. They call it the Dybbuk Box, and those who touched it were never the same. Whispers in the night, shadows in the glass, a curse older than memory itself. This is not a story of comfort, but of terror, loss, and mystery that refuses to die. If you have ever searched for sleeping stories, for sleep stories for adults, or even bedtime story for adults that hold you in suspense until the last word, you found one unlike any other. This is more than a bedtime story. It is a journey into shadows, a legend told in whispers, a free sleep story that will stay with you long after you close your eyes. Tonight, we open the box, and once you hear what waits inside, you may never forget it. It began in the most ordinary of places, a quiet auction house on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The kind of place where antique clocks, dusty portraits, and forgotten heirlooms change hands with little more than a scratch of pen and the nod of a head. To most who attended, it was just another Saturday. But for one man, it would be the day his life and the lives of those he loved took a turn into shadows from which there would be no return. He had come searching for something small, perhaps a desk or a painting, anything to bring character to his new home. What he found instead was a plain wooden cabinet. It looked unremarkable at first glance, no larger than a bedside table, crafted from dark wood that had dulled with age. The doors were simple, the handles worn smooth, but there was something about it, something that seemed to pull at him. While other items were paraded before the crowd with the auctioneer's booming voice, the cabinet sat quietly, waiting, as if it already knew its destiny. The auctioneer introduced it casually, calling it a wine cabinet of Eastern European origin. No one else seemed particularly interested. The bidding began low, and when the man raised his hand, no one challenged him. Within minutes, it was his. No applause, no gasps, just a gavel striking wood and a receipt placed in his hand. A simple purchase, or so it seemed, but before he could leave, a thin, pale woman approached him. Her eyes were dark and tired, her movements hesitant, as if she carried a weight that could never be lifted. She leaned close and whispered words that sent a chill across his skin. "Never open it. Promise me. You must never open it." The man laughed softly, thinking it's superstition. He asked if she knew its history, but she only shook her head, repeating the same warning with more urgency. "It brings nothing but sorrow." Her voice trembled as though the memory of it was too much to bear. Then she stepped back, turned away, and was gone into the crowd. He carried the cabinet to his car with little thought, unaware that from the moment his hands touched its surface, his life was no longer his own. At first, the box was nothing more than a curiosity in his home. He placed it in his workshop, intending to refinish the wood, perhaps even sell at a profit. But in the days that followed, strange things began to creep into the edges of his life. It started with the dreams. The first dream was vivid yet unplaceable. He found himself standing in a hallway that seemed endless, its walls lined with doors. From somewhere in the distance, he heard a voice, low, guttural, whispering in a language he did not understand. He could not see the figure, but he felt its presence drawing closer. He awoke in a cold sweat, the sheets twisted tightly around him. The next night, the dream returned. This time, the shadow was closer, standing just beyond his sight. He could hear it whispering, the cadence rhythmic, almost like a chant. The words were foreign, but the tone carried an unmistakable malice. Each time he woke, the scent of jasmine lingered in the air, clinging to his skin though no flowers grew anywhere near his home. By the third night, he was afraid to sleep. His exhaustion grew heavy, yet the dreams were unavoidable. In one, he turned a corner in that endless hallway and saw for the first time a shadowy figure, human in form but stretched unnaturally tall. Its face was obscured, its mouth moving rapidly, spilling words that scraped at his mind like broken glass. When he tried to run, the doors along the hallway rattled violently, as if something unseen was trying to break through. He woke screaming, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. He told himself it was nothing, the stress of work or the suggestion planted by the strange woman's warning. Yet deep inside, he knew the box was to blame. He had moved it into his living room by then, determined to polish and restore it. But every time he touched it, his hands grew numb, as if the wood itself was leaching the warmth from his skin. Still, he dismissed the fear. People fear what they do not understand. He thought, it is only wood. His mother came to visit a few days later, a kind, gentle woman. She believed her son's fascination with antiques was a harmless hobby. When she saw the cabinet, she approached it with curiosity, brushing her fingers across its smooth surface. She remarked how unusual it was, how heavy it seemed for its size. Her son began to tell her of its history, or rather, the little he knew of it, when suddenly she froze. Her hand had lingered on the cabinet handle. Her eyes widened, her mouth parted, and she collapsed to the floor without a word. Panic gripped him as he rushed to her side. Her body was limp, her lips trembling, her face drained of all color. She was alive, but she could not speak. Her eyes darted wildly, filled with a terror that words could never capture. He called for help, his voice breaking as he pleaded for her to answer, but only silence met him. The doctors would later say it was a stroke, a tragic but natural occurrence. Yet he knew it was not natural. She had touched the cabinet, and within seconds, her voice had been taken from her. The coincidence was too sharp, the timing too precise. He returned home that night to the side of the cabinet, standing silently in the corner. Its wooden doors shut tight, as if mocking him. The air around it seemed heavier, pressing down upon the room. He could no longer ignore it. The shadow in his dreams, the scent of jasmine, his mother's collapse. It all pointed back to this one object, and yet as he stared at it, he felt something stir deep inside his mind. A question, unbidden, whispered like an echo of the dreams. What lies within? The woman's voice returned to him then, her desperate plea from the auction house. Never open it, but the shadow whispered louder. And as the night grew darker, he realized with dawning horror that the true story of the cabinet was only just beginning. The cabinet looked ordinary to anyone else. It was nothing more than a tired old piece of furniture, sturdy, square, and unimpressive, the kind of thing that might sit forgotten in the corner of an attic. Yet to the man who had purchased it, there was something about it that demanded attention. His mother's sudden collapse had already tied dread to its presence, but in the days that followed, curiosity began gnawing at him like a restless insect. It was when he finally pried the doors open to examine its interior that he realized the box was not ordinary at all. At first glance, the inside was dark and empty, but when his eyes adjusted, he noticed faint lines etched into the wood. He leaned closer, running his fingers over them, and the hair on his arms rose. These were not random scratches. They were deliberate carvings. Symbols lined the inside walls. Strange marks that seemed to spiral inward, circling like a trap meant to contain something. Some were written in Hebrew, words he could not read, though the shapes carried a gravity that pressed down on him, as if their meaning reached beyond language. Other scratches were less precise, jagged gouges, as though clawed hands had raked the wood in desperation. The mixture unsettled him. Why would protective prayers and violent scratches exist side by side within the same space? The man stepped back, the air inside the cabinet carrying a faint, bitter smell of earth mixed with something floral. Jasmine, the same scent that haunted his dreams. He closed the doors quickly, but the scent lingered, clinging to his skin. That night, as he lay in bed, the house seemed restless. Lights flickered in the hallway, though the bulbs were new. A glass on the kitchen counter shattered without reason, scattering across the floor. He checked every window, every lock, but found no sign of intrusion. Yet the scent of jasmine drifted through the rooms, growing stronger with each passing hour. He told himself it was stress. A man could convince himself of many things when faced with the unknown. But when the shadows in his home seemed to move just slightly against the walls, when the silence itself seemed to breathe, he knew stress was not the answer. Something was inside his home, and it was not content to be ignored. The following evening, two of his friends came to visit. He had told them about the strange cabinet, more as a curiosity than a confession, though his voice had betrayed a nervous edge. They laughed at first, teasing him for buying a ghost in a box. But when he showed it to them, their smiles faltered. One of them, a woman with a keen sense of intuition, ran her hand along the edge and shivered. "It feels wrong," she murmured, "like it doesn't belong here." Her companion tried to dismiss it, but unease crept into his voice as well. "It's just a box," he said, though he refused to touch it. They stayed late into the night, sipping coffee and speaking of lighter things, yet their laughter was thinner than usual, their eyes drawn again and again to the cabinet in the corner of the room. When they left, both wore troubled expressions. The next morning, he received a call. The woman had woken in the night screaming, plagued by a dream of a dark figure standing over her bed. She could not shake the image, and her body ached as though she had been gripped tightly by invisible hands. Her friend, too, had suffered, vomiting throughout the night, pale and weak as though stricken by illness with no cause. Neither had experienced such things before. Both swore they would never return to his house again. He sat in silence after the call, staring at the cabinet. It did not move. It did not speak, yet it seemed to pulse with a quiet satisfaction, as if it knew what it had done. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence, but deep inside, he felt the box was feeding, stretching, extending its shadow into the lives of those around him. The nights grew worse. The flickering of lights became constant. Objects shifted on their own, keys sliding across tables, books tumbling from shelves. And always, the jasmine returned, filling his lungs, sweet yet suffocating, as though it wanted to drown him in its perfume. On the fourth night, he awoke to a sound so faint he thought at first it was a dream, a low groaning, deep and slow, like the strain of ancient wood under unbearable weight. But as he sat upright in bed, he realized the sound was coming from the living room, from the cabinet. He forced himself to rise, each step heavy as though he were walking into water. The house was dark, the silence broken only by that groan, drawn out and mournful. When he reached the living room, the air was icy, his breath visible in the faint glow from the street lamp outside. The cabinet sat where it always did, its doors shut, its surface still. But the sound continued, vibrating softly through the air, as if the wood itself was trying to breathe. He could not bring himself to open it. Instead, he returned to his room and fetched a small recorder. If the world was to believe him, if he was to believe himself, he needed proof. He placed the device near the cabinet, pressed record, and left it through the night. The next morning, he replayed the tape. At first, it was empty, only the hiss of silence. Then the groans began, faint but undeniable. He listened as they deepened, rising and falling like the sighs of something ancient and restless. And then came the whispers, not one voice, but many, layered over one another, speaking in a chorus of languages he could not identify. Some murmured softly, others rasped with anger. He listened in horror as a sudden crash echoed on the tape, though nothing had fallen in the room that night. And at the very end, just before the recording stopped, came a sound that froze him where he sat. A breath, long, slow, deliberate, as if something on the other side of the cabinet doors had leaned close to the recorder and exhaled. His hands trembled as he stopped the playback. The room around him felt heavier, the air pressing against his skin. He looked at the cabinet, and though its doors remained closed, he no longer believed it was silent. Something inside was listening. Something inside was waiting. And as he sat there, with the recording still echoing in his ears, he realized a woman at the auction had not been warning him to protect himself. She had been warning him to protect the world. The cabinet was not just a piece of wood. It was a prison, and whatever it held had begun to stir. When the man could no longer ignore the box, when the whispers on his recordings and the shadows in his dreams became unbearable, he did what many do when they find themselves in the presence of something they cannot understand. He began to search for its history. At first, it was nothing more than idle research, late nights spent on the computer, pouring through auction records, archives, and old estate documents. But slowly, Threads began to appear, strands of a story too strange and too precise to be coincidence. The name of the woman who had once owned the cabinet surfaced again and again. Her name was Havila, and with that name came a history scarred by one of humanity's darkest chapters, the Holocaust. Havila had been a young woman when the world around her collapsed into terror. She was taken from her home in Poland, separated from her family, and thrust into the horrors of the camps. Many did not survive. She did, but survival had a cost. For even after liberation, she carried scars that no eye could see and burdens that could not be lifted. In testimonies recorded years later, she spoke not only of the cruelty of men, but of something else, something older, darker, hidden within the chaos. She claimed that in those years of despair, she encountered a presence that fed on suffering, a spirit without rest, a creature of Jewish folklore, known as a Dybbuk. In the stories of old, a Dybbuk was said to be the soul of the wicked, torn from peace, wandering the earth, searching for bodies to inhabit, for lives to corrupt. Unlike spirits that linger in grief, a Dybbuk clung with violence, sinking its claws into the living, twisting them from the inside out. For centuries, rabbis and mystics had warned of such beings, of rituals to banish them, of boxes to trap them. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, remnants of folklore meant to frighten children into obedience. But to Havila, it was no story. It was her truth. She said the Dybbuk followed her, whispering in the dark, latching onto her body with icy fingers. In the camp, she watched fellow prisoners wither overnight, their eyes hollow, their voices stolen, their sanity slipping away as if drained by something unseen. She came to believe the Dybbuk fed on the despair that soaked the air of that place, growing stronger in the shadow of so much suffering. When the war ended and freedom came, she could not shake it. Liberation brought life. But the spirit followed her across borders, through cities, into the fragile peace of her later years. The shadow whispered still, doors rattled, lights dimmed, and always the scent of jasmine filled her rooms, an aroma that to others seemed pleasant, but to her became a mark of dread. In desperation, she sought help. Rabbis, mystics, men of faith who knew the old ways. They listened, some with pity, some with fear. Together they performed rituals, prayers, the binding of texts, and the burning of herbs. Yet the Dybbuk remained, clinging like smoke. At last, one man, aged and weary, whispered a final solution: to trap it, to seal the restless spirit within an object, binding it so it could do no further harm. The ritual was dangerous. It demanded incantations, blood, salt, and fire. It demanded the will to face the spirit directly. Havila prepared herself, and in a ceremony few dared witness, she contained the Dybbuk within the wine cabinet. She had been told it would take something familiar, something intimate, to bind the spirit. The box had been hers since girlhood, a relic from her family before the war, a piece of a world long destroyed. Perhaps it was fitting that the last remnant of her old life became the prison for the horror that stalked her new one. When the ritual ended, the cabinet shook violently, its wood groaning as though straining against invisible chains. The scent of jasmine filled the room, suffocating, overwhelming. Then silence, absolute silence. The Dybbuk was sealed for the rest of her life. Havila spoke little of the box. She told her children only what they needed to know: that must never be opened, never sold, never pass into the hands of strangers. She begged them to bury it with her when her time came, to keep it sealed away from the living. She told them the spirit was cunning, that it whispered promises, that it fed on curiosity, and she warned them with a trembling voice: if the box is opened, the Dybbuk will be free again. Her family did not understand. To them, she was a survivor who had seen too much, endured too much, perhaps broken in places they could not mend. They respected her silence, but grew fearful of her obsession with the cabinet. Some whispered that her mind was haunted more by memory than by spirits. But her eyes, when she looked upon the box, told another story, eyes that carried the weight of knowing. When Havila passed, the family gathered, as families do. They grieved, they remembered, and they faced the burden of her belongings. Among them stood the cabinet. It radiated unease, even to those who did not believe. The instructions she had left were clear. It must never be opened, never kept, never given to another. But fear is a strange master. Her children and grandchildren looked upon the box with dread. They did not want it in their homes, did not want the whispers of folklore or the possibility of curse lingering near their lives. One by one, they refused. They could not bury it, for something about it resisted. They could not burn it, for fire would not catch upon its wood. And so, unwilling to destroy it, yet terrified to keep it, they abandoned her wish. They placed it in storage, hidden, forgotten, as though ignoring it could erase its presence. Years passed. The family scattered, her descendants drifting far from the places she once called home. The box lingered in silence, sealed yet patient, until one day it surfaced again, pulled from storage and pushed into the world of estate sales and auctions. When the man who now owned it raised his hand that day in Portland, he had unknowingly broken a promise made by the dead. Havila's plea had been simple. Never let it be opened, never let it pass to another. Yet here it was, resting in the living room of a stranger, whispering once more through scratches, groans, and the scent of jasmine. The man's research left him shaken. He read the survivor's testimony late into the night, the words blurring before his eyes, yet pressing into his heart like cold steel. He imagined her standing in the camp, surrounded by death, clinging to life while something unseen fed on despair. He imagined her trembling as she bound the spirit, her prayers desperate. Her were the only barrier between the living and the restless dead. He closed his computer and looked at the cabinet across the room. Its wooden doors were shut, silent, patient. Yet he could not shake the feeling that it was waiting, waiting as it had waited in the camp, waiting as it had waited in her home, waiting now in his. And then came the truth that chilled him more than any dream or whisper. Havila's descendants had feared the box so much they refused to keep it. They had known its weight, had carried its shadow, and they had chosen to cast it away. But no matter how far they fled, the box had found a way back into the world, into his world. He sat in the dim light of his living room, the air heavy with jasmine, and wondered, had he bought the cabinet, or had the cabinet chosen him? Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. The house groaned softly in the dark, and from the corner of the room came a sound, so faint, so subtle, yet unmistakable. A whisper. The cabinet did not move. Its doors did not open. But the whisper lingered, curling into the silence. A voice, ancient and broken, carrying through the wood. And in that moment, he realized Havila had not trapped the Dybbuk forever. She had only delayed it. The box was not meant to remain hidden. It was meant to be found. There comes a moment when fear turns to desperation. After the recordings, after the dreams, after learning of the Holocaust survivor who once bound the spirit within the cabinet, the man decided he could no longer keep it. He convinced himself that if he passed along, if he placed a burden in another's hands, he might free himself from its grip. And so he did what many in his time would do. He listed it for sale. At first, it seemed easy. The listing went up online, the description plain, the photographs unremarkable. To most, it was simply an old wine cabinet, an antique with a certain rustic charm. Within days, someone purchased it. The man felt a strange relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. The cabinet was carried from his home, and for the first time in weeks, the air seemed lighter. The jasmine faded. The shadows receded. But relief is fragile when tied to cursed things. Within a week, the box returned, delivered back to his doorstep. The buyer had insisted on a refund. No explanation, no detailed complaint, only a brief message. It is unbearable. The man felt anger rising beneath his fear. He told himself it was absurd. Buyer's regret, a change of heart, nothing more. He relisted the box, lowering the price, and another buyer appeared. Again, it left his home. Again, the air seemed lighter. And again, it returned. This time, the message was sharper. Something is wrong with it. Don't sell again. It went on like this, again and again. Each time, the cabinet would leave, only to find its way back. Each buyer refused to keep it, their reasons vague, their voices trembling. One woman wrote only 3 words, "It watches me." The man began to understand. It was not simply that the box was cursed. It was that it refused to be discarded. It chose its keeper, and it had chosen him. Still, he tried. He shipped it to distant towns. He sold it to strangers who knew nothing of its history. But every time, without fail, it was returned. With each failed attempt, the whispers grew louder in his dreams, the scent of jasmine stronger, the shadows more restless. It was as though the box resented his betrayal, as though it was punishing him for trying to abandon it. The reports from those who briefly owned it chilled him. One man said mirrors in his home had shifted, showing shadows that moved when no one stood before them. Another claimed every electronic device in his house failed within days. Phones, televisions, even lights. They flickered, dimmed, and died, leaving rooms plunged into icy darkness. He spoke of waking to see his breath clouding in the air, the temperature dropping so suddenly he feared he would freeze where he stood. But it was the story of the student that struck him most. A young man, eager and curious, had purchased a cabinet, dismissing warnings as folklore. He wanted to study it, to prove it was nothing more than wood and myth. Within days, he was calling friends in the middle of the night, his voice broken, his words fragmented. He spoke of shadows standing at the edges of his vision, of voices muttering in languages he did not understand. He claimed his own reflection smiled when he did not. He stopped sleeping, terrified of what awaited him in his dreams. One night, his neighbors heard screams echoing from his apartment. They forced the door open and found him curled in the corner, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body trembling violently. The cabinet sat at the center of the room, its doors closed, silent and patient. The student was taken to the hospital, his mind fractured, muttering incoherently about claws in the dark and whispers in the walls. The box was returned soon after, left on a man's doorstep without explanation. Only a slip of paper tucked beneath the handle, for words written in a trembling hand. "It doesn't leave me alone." The man stared at the note for a long time, the words burning into his mind. It was not only his burden, it was the burden of anyone who touched it, anyone who tried to claim it. The box carried its curse wherever it went, infecting every life it entered. And yet, no one could hold it. No one could bear it. He looked at it that night, the cabinet sitting quietly in the corner of his home. Its wooden frame cast long shadows across the floor, its presence heavier than stone. He wondered how many had touched it before him, how many had suffered, how many had tried and failed to rid themselves of it. And he wondered how long he could endure before it consumed him as it had consumed the student. The air grew colder, the lights flickered, and from somewhere deep within the wood, a groan echoed, long, low, and suffocating. The man felt it then more than ever before. The box was alive, and it was never letting him go. Word of the Dybbuk Box had begun to spread beyond hushed whispers and anonymous notes. By now, stories of its curse were shared among collectors, whispered on forums, written in blogs, and debated by skeptics. Most dismissed them as urban legends, exaggerations born from overactive imaginations. But for a small team of paranormal investigators, the cabinet was no myth. It was a challenge. They called themselves seekers of truth. They had built their reputation chasing shadows across abandoned asylums, recording voices in deserted churches, and tracking cold spots through empty mansions. They prided themselves on exposing hoaxes and documenting the unexplained with scientific rigor. To them, the Dybbuk Box was the ultimate test, a chance to prove whether folklore and horror stories had any foundation in reality. The man who owned it did not hesitate when they offered to take it off his hands. Relief washed over him as they loaded it into their van, their cameras recording every moment, their faces sharp with determination. To him, it felt like release, like stepping out from beneath a suffocating weight. But to the investigators, it was the beginning of an experiment they believed they could control. The box was placed in their research space, a converted warehouse lined with shelves of equipment, thermal cameras, electromagnetic meters, recorders, and monitors. They prepared with precision, every angle covered, every instrument calibrated. The cabinet sat at the center, unremarkable yet commanding. Its presence alone seemed to shift the air, heavy and thick, though none of them admitted aloud. From the moment the session began, the readings defied reason. Magnetic fields spiked violently around the box, far beyond anything the investigators had recorded in years of research. Compasses spun without direction. Digital meters shrieked with static. One moment, the air around it burned with impossible heat, causing thermometers to surge. The next, an icy chill swept the room, visible breath curling from their mouths. They recorded everything, their voices growing tense, their excitement mixing with unease. One spoke of the scent that lingered faintly, jasmine, sweet and suffocating, wafting in waves. Another noted the way the shadows near the cabinet stretched unnaturally long, bending against the angles of light. When they placed recorders nearby, the whispers began. Faint at first, a murmur, like the shifting of fabric or the sigh of the wind. Then words, fragmented, layered, spoken in tongues they could not identify. The voices seemed to overlap, some distant, some impossibly close, as though one stood just behind them. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances but pressed forward. Hours passed, their equipment capturing anomaly after anomaly. The tension in the room mounted. The box remained closed, yet it felt alive, its silence deceptive, its stillness unbearable. One of them, a man named Daniel, insisted on speaking directly to it. He leaned close, his voice calm but edged with defiance, asking if something truly resided within, demanding a sign. The room answered, the monitors blazed with static, screens flickering violently. A wave of pressure rippled through the air, rattling the metal frames of their equipment. The scent of jasmine filled the room so thick it made them gag. Then Daniel staggered back, clutching his chest, his body convulsed, his face twisted in agony. He gasped, eyes wide, shouting that something was inside him. The others rushed to his side, but he pushed them away, his voice a guttural rasp not his own. He clawed at his chest as though tearing at something unseen, screaming words and languages his companions did not recognize. His body writhed, his voice fractured between his own and something deeper, darker, ancient. The cameras shook as one investigator fumbled with them, the footage capturing chaos. The box looming in the center, the man collapsing, others shouting, the monitors flashing violently. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the lights exploded. Glass rained down. Darkness swallowed the room. In the recording that survived, only fragments remain. A scream, a crash, the sound of footsteps running, stumbling. The faint, horrifying groan which shifting, as though the box itself breathed. Then silence, broken only by the camera falling to floor, the image twisting, the lens pointed toward nothing. The footage ends there. When the investigators emerged hours later, their faces were pale, their voices broken. They refused to speak of what had happened, refused to share the uncut recording. Daniel was taken to the hospital, his body intact, but his mind shattered. He muttered incoherently about a hand clutching his heart, about shadows climbing inside his lungs, about whispers that refused to stop. The cabinet remained untouched, sitting silent in the center of their space. They had wanted proof, and they had received it, but not in the way they had hoped. They abandoned the project, leaving the box behind. None would return for it. None would claim responsibility. And yet, like all cursed things, it did not remain abandoned for long. In the days that followed, workers at the warehouse spoke of strange sounds echoing through the halls. Lights flickered despite new bulbs. Tools vanished, only to reappear in strange places. The scent of jasmine lingered in rooms where no flowers grew. At night, groans carried through the building, low and mournful, as though something trapped within wood was pressing against its prison. One by one, the workers refused to enter the space. Fear spread quietly, unspoken but undeniable. Eventually, the cabinet was removed, delivered once again to the man who had first purchased it, as though invisible hands had guided it back to him. This time, it was accompanied not by silence, but by evidence. A recording, truncated and abrupt, capturing the last moments before the investigators fled. The man played it in the dim light of his home, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. Static, whispers, a scream, the crash of glass. Then the sound that haunted him most, a groan, long and deliberate, rising not from human lips but from deep within the wood. It was the sound of something alive. The recording ended with chaos, The final image captured by the fallen camera, a fleeting glimpse of the cabinet. Its doors shut, its shadows stretching impossibly long across the floor. And then nothing. The man sat in silence, the recording echoing in his mind. He realized what the investigators had already learned. The Dybbuk Box could not be studied. It could not be controlled. It was not an object. It was a prison. And what it contained was growing restless. The footage cut abruptly with screams, the camera striking the floor. Yet the sound did not stop. For even in silence, the whispers carried on, threading through the air, curling into his ears. The box was waiting, and it was far from finished. By now, the Dybbuk Box had frightened collectors, shattered families, and sent paranormal investigators fleeing with footage they dared not release in full. For most, that was enough to stay away. But not for everyone. There are always those who believe that fear is nothing more than a failure of reason, that the human mind, fragile and imaginative, creates monsters where none exist. One of those men was Professor Richard Haldane. Haldane was a respected academic, a lecturer in psychology and neuroscience at a university known for its research. He specialized in the study of mass hysteria, cultural folklore, and the way belief could warp perception. To him, ghosts were only shadows of the mind, demons the product of suggestion, and curses nothing more than stories told too often until they became real to those who believed. When he first heard of the Dybbuk Box, he scoffed. An antique wine cabinet that drove people mad, that collapsed mothers and sent students to hospitals? It was a kind of tale he taught his students to dissect, a perfect example of psychosomatic contagion. Fear spreads faster than truth, he told them. Tell a man he's bought a curse box, and soon his lights will flicker and his heart will pound. Not because the box has power, but because belief does. So when the opportunity came to examine the cabinet himself, he seized it. He requested it from the previous owner, insisting it would be part of a controlled study. To his surprise, the man agreed, perhaps relieved to see it leave once more. The box was delivered to the university under Haldane's supervision, carried not into his home, but into the sterile walls of his laboratory. The lab was the very opposite of mystery. Bright lights, white walls, cameras in every corner, shelves lined with instruments. For Haldane, this was the place where superstition crumbled beneath evidence. He placed the box at the center of his desk. Its wooden doors closed, its surface dull under fluorescent light. He stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the chill, the jasmine, the whisper of fear. Nothing came. He smiled. He began with simple tests. He measured its weight, its density, its magnetic field. He checked the wood for signs of rot, of tampering, of hidden devices that might account for strange effects. The readings were ordinary, the results boring. Wood and nails, as he had suspected. At night, he left it under the watch of security cameras, determined to record any anomaly. His colleagues teased him gently, some skeptical like him, others more cautious, reminding him of the box's reputation. He dismissed their warnings with a wave. It is not the box that haunts people, he said. It is the stories they bring to it. But stories of power, and the Dybbuk Box was older than his skepticism. The first incident was subtle. A graduate student entered the lab to retrieve notes left overnight. He later told Haldane that the room felt colder than usual, the air heavy, his breath visible despite the heating system working perfectly. He brushed it off as stress, but his unease lingered. The second incident was harder to dismiss. A cleaning crew reported that their equipment failed the moment they wheeled it inside. Their machine sputtered, lights dimmed, and one cleaner swore she heard a low groan echoing the room though she stood alone. Haldane grew frustrated. To him, these were coincidences, malfunctions, the ordinary chaos of human environments. Yet the reports piled up. Shadows seen in the reflective glass of cabinets. Doors rattling when no one touched them. A faint scent, sweet, floral, unmistakable. A jasmine that drifted to the halls at night. He decided to test it directly. He locked the lab, sealed the doors, and instructed the cameras to record continuously. For hours, he sat across from the cabinet, staring at it, waiting for movement, for sound, for anything that could confirm the claims. His notes grew long and dismissive. No movement, no whispers, No paranormal activity. But when he reviewed the footage the next day, his blood ran cold. At 3 in the morning, while he sat in silence, the cabinet's doors opened. Not wide, not dramatically, but slow, deliberate, as if unseen fingers pried them apart. He did not move. He did not react. He did not even look at it, as though he had not seen. The doors hung open for several minutes. The shadows within impossibly deep darkened the room itself. Then, just as slowly, they closed again. Halden watched the recording again and again, his mind racing. How had he not noticed? Was it a trick of the light? A flaw in the recording? Yet the cameras were flawless. The angles perfect. The wood creaked audibly as the doors moved. A sound captured clearly on the audio feed. He had been there, awake, and yet he had not heard. For the first time, doubt pierced his armor of skepticism. He decided to test it further. He placed sensitive instruments inside the cabinet. Thermometers, audio recorders, electromagnetic probes. He sealed the doors, left the lab, and waited when he returned the next morning. The results were impossible. Temperatures had surged and dropped erratically, climbing to near boiling before plunging below freezing. The audio recorder captured groans, whispers, and at one point, a voice muttering words in what several linguists later identified as a corrupted form of Hebrew. Halden grew pale, his hands trembling as he reviewed the data. He told himself there had to be an explanation, a malfunction, a hoax, yet he had locked the lab himself. No one else had entered. The following night, he stayed again. The cameras rolled, the instruments hummed, and the box sat quietly before him. Hours passed in silence. Then, at once, the lights flickered. The air thickened, pressing down on his lungs. His monitors surged with static. And from the box came a sound, a long, deliberate breath, exhaling through wood. Halden's heart pounded. He forced himself to approach, every step heavy, his body trembling with fear he could no longer deny. He reached out to touch it, and the wood was warm, unnaturally warm, as though something alive pulsed beneath the surface. He recoiled, stumbling back, the scent of jasmine choking him. He left the lab that night shaken, his skepticism fractured, but he told no one. Not yet. The next morning, his colleagues arrived to find his office door ajar, papers scattered, instruments overturned. The monitors cracked. Halden was gone, vanished without trace. And on his desk, sitting silently, patiently, was the Dybbuk Box, its doors shut, its surface still, as though it had never moved at all. By the time the box returned once more, the air around it felt different. It was no longer just an object that whispered in dreams or breathed in the silence of night. It was something waiting, something deliberate, as if every failed attempt to abandon it had been part of its design. The man who still unwillingly kept it had grown exhausted, his nights filled with static-filled recordings, his days drowned in the scent of jasmine. Yet, when he finally dared to examine the box more closely, he discovered something none before him had noticed. The cabinet was heavier than it should have been. Not by much, but enough to make him wonder. The wood was thick, yes, but the weight seemed unbalanced, uneven, as though something inside shifted when he moved it. For weeks, this thought nagged at him. He ran his fingers across its seams, tapped along the edges, pressed at its corners, and then, one late evening, he felt it. A panel on the inside, faintly loose, as if waiting for someone with desperate hands to find it. He pried it carefully. The wood groaned, resisting, as if unwilling to give up its secret. Finally, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow compartment hidden deep within. Inside lay an object wrapped in cloth, so old it crumbled at his touch. Within the folds rested a book, a diary, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed and brittle. On its surface, etched faintly by hand, was writing in Hebrew, faded but still legible to those who could read it. The man could not, but he knew someone who could, a rabbi from a nearby congregation, a scholar of ancient texts, agreed to examine it. The rabbi was cautious, hesitant even to touch the diary, as if sensing the weight of its history. He turned the fragile pages slowly, reading silently at first, his lips pressed tight, As the hours passed, his face grew pale, his hands trembling. Finally, he closed the book and whispered, "This is not a diary. It is a record, a warning." The writing spoke of rituals, ancient, precise, and dangerous. They described the Dybbuk not as a myth, but as a reality, a restless spirit bound to earth by rage, despair, or violence. It could not be killed, the text insisted, for it was already beyond death. It could only be contained, sealed away in vessels strong enough to hold it, vessels marked with prayers and symbols, reinforced with sacrifice. The rabbi turned to one passage, his voice barely steady as he read aloud. "The spirit cannot be destroyed, only contained. To break the seal is to unleash it, and to unleash it is to condemn the living." The man listened, his heart heavy. The words confirmed what he already feared, that the box was not curse wood, but a prison, that every whisper, every shadow, every scent of jasmine was not the box itself, but a thing clawing from within. But the diary carried more than warnings. As the rabbi read further, his brow furrowed. The text spoke of other vessels, other boxes. The ritual described was not unique. It hinted at others like it, scattered through history, crafted by different hands to bind different spirits, some lost, some buried, some perhaps still waiting. The idea was unbearable. One cursed cabinet was horror enough, but dozens, hundreds? How many restless spirits have been bound and hidden, each waiting for the day their prison was broken? The rabbi shut the book with trembling hands. "This should never have been found," he said. "It was meant to be hidden, sealed forever. Whoever left this inside the box knew the truth, that if the spirit escaped, no one could stop it." For days afterward, the man could not sleep. The words of the diary looped in his mind. The spirit cannot be destroyed, only contained. He imagined others scattered across the earth, resting quietly in forgotten attics, in buried ruins, in the homes of unsuspecting families who thought they possessed nothing more than old heirlooms. And then came the line he could not ignore. It was scrawled near the end of the diary, the handwriting rushed, jagged, almost frantic, a final note left by trembling hands. "If it escapes, it will seek the blood of the living." The man stared at the words until they blurred before his eyes. He closed the diary, locked it away, and sat in silence with the cabinet looming in the corner. It had given up its secret, but not its prisoner, though it groaned softly, as if laughing. The scent of jasmine filled the room once more, sweet and suffocating, and he realized that the diary was not a warning to him. It was a prophecy. The Dybbuk box was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be found. There are curses one can escape from, if only by distance, but possession is different. It is not about objects or rooms or whispers in the night. It is about the self, about the body and the mind becoming ground claimed by something else. When the Dybbuk box passed into the hands of a new owner, the man believed he had been fortunate. He had bought what seemed to be nothing more than an antique, unaware of the weight of history behind it. To him, it was simply another curious purchase, something to fill an empty corner of his home. But soon, the corner of his home became the corner of his dreams. The nightmares began quickly, vivid and violent. In them, he found himself standing in endless corridors, the walls scratched with symbols, the air heavy with jasmine. Each night he walked farther into the darkness. Each night the whispers grew louder, and every morning he awoke not in bed, but standing beside the cabinet, his hand resting on its handle, his mind blank to how he had gotten there. At first, he dismissed it as sleepwalking, stress, the strange tricks of a restless mind. But the dreams persisted, and the moments of waking became more disturbing. Some nights, he awoke with his fingernails broken, his fingertips bloodied, as if he had been clawing at the wood. Other nights, he found the cabinet's doors slightly ajar, though he swore he had left them closed. Neighbors began to notice. They saw movement in his windows long after midnight. Shadows tall and twisted, flickering across the glass though he lived alone. Some said they saw figures standing motionless in the rooms, watching. Others claimed lights in the house pulsed unnaturally, glowing and dimming as though synchronized with a beating heart. The animals noticed first. A neighbor's dog, usually friendly and calm, refused to approach the property, growling low whenever dragged too close. Cats hissed when carried across the threshold. Even birds that nested nearby abandoned their perches, circling the house but never landing. Something unseen repelled them. Something older than instinct. Inside, the man's life unraveled. He began to lose time. Hours vanished, moments slipped away. He would come to his house rearranged, objects misplaced, walls smeared with markings he did not remember making. At work, colleagues whisper of his pale complexion, his shaking hands, his sudden habit of muttering under his breath. The truth revealed itself slowly, in fragments that chilled those around him. One evening, a friend visited, concerned by his silence. As they spoke, the man's voice shifted. Mid-sentence, it fractured, splitting into layers. One voice his own, another deeper, guttural, inhuman. The friend froze, staring as a man's lips moved with words that did not belong to him. Languages poured out, tangled together. Hebrew, Aramaic, guttural sounds no ear could place. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The man blinked, confused, unaware of what he had spoken. The friend fled, never to return. In the nights that followed, the possession deepened. His reflection began to betray him. In the mirror, his face seemed slow to move, his eyes darker, his smile wrong. At times, the reflection did not match his motions at all, lingered with expressions he did not make. The man smashed the mirrors, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The neighbors spoke more urgently now. They said chanting could be heard through the walls at night, rhythmic and harsh, as though dozens of voices sang in unison. They claimed shadows crawled across the walls of his home, even when the curtains were closed. But it was the symbols that truly terrified them. One night, the man erupted in screams so violent they tore through the neighborhood. Lights flickered in nearby houses. Glass cracked in window panes. Alarms blared without cause. When dawn came, the house was silent again, but the walls inside told the story. Symbols had been carved into the plaster, jagged and precise, spiraling across every surface. Some resembled the markings inside the box itself. Protective prayers twisted into warnings, Hebrew letters broken and scattered. Others were shapes no scholar could identify, patterns that seemed to move when stared at too long. When the neighbors dared to look inside through the broken window, they saw him. The man was on his knees, his hands bloody from carving, his body shaking as he screamed into the walls. His voice overlapped again, his words distorted, rising and falling in a chant that seemed not of this world. And then, with a sudden clarity, he stopped. He turned, his face pale, his eyes wide, and he whispered one phrase with a voice not his own. "It's coming." The neighbors fled. Authorities arrived later, but they found only silence. The man sat motionless, his back against the cabinet, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. He would not speak. He would not move, except to scratch more markings into walls, as though compelled by a force beyond him. The Dybbuk Box had ceased to whisper. It no longer needed to. It had found its vessel. There are moments in history when survival is no longer about strength or reason, but about the fragile strands of faith, memory, and desperate tradition. The Dybbuk Box had crossed oceans, torn through families, and devoured the sanity of all who tried to keep it. It had whispered to children, broken the strong, and hollowed out the weak. Yet in its path, it left not only ruin, but clues, fragments of the ancient knowledge that had once bound it. The diary had spoken of rituals, words, symbols, and sacrifices meant not to destroy the Dybbuk, but to contain it. And among the scattered descendants of Havilah, the Holocaust survivor who had first trapped the spirit, there remained stories, half-whispered and rarely spoken, of the way she had sealed it. At first, they resisted. The family had long rejected the box, fearing it as much as they despised it. They had refused to keep it, had pushed it away, had buried its memory as best they could. But blood remembers. And when the man who now kept the box approached them with the diary in hand, with trembling voice and hollow eyes, some among them finally agreed. One of Havilah's granddaughters, an old woman with a voice as brittle as dry leaves, whispered the truth. She had heard the ritual spoken of when she was a child. Words passed secretly from her grandmother's lips, warnings carried in fear. She had not believed them then. She believed them now. The ritual was dangerous. It demanded courage, precision, and sacrifice. Blood must be offered. Salt must circle the vessel. Prayers in Hebrew, ancient and precise, must be spoken without hesitation. And above all, fire must be prepared, not to burn the spirit, for it could not burn, but to cleanse the vessel once it was sealed. So they gathered in secret, a handful of descendants, bound not by choice but by inheritance. The man who had brought them together stood among them, pale, sleepless, his eyes hollow from the possession that clung to him like smoke. The cabinet sat in the center of the room, patient, silent, but heavy with anticipation. The first step was a circle. Salt was poured in an unbroken line around the box, precise and careful. The grain shimmered faintly in the dim light, a fragile barrier between the living and the thing within. Candles were placed at the corners of the room, their flames steady, their shadows long. The air grew heavy as they worked, as though the box knew what was coming. The second step was the offering. A shallow dish was brought forward, and blood was spilled into it. Voluntarily, a cut across the palm, crimson drops falling in rhythm. The scent of iron mingled with the faint sweetness of jasmine, creating a nauseating blend that hung in the air. The blood was brushed across the symbols carved into the cabinet, renewing them, feeding the ritual with life. The prayers began next. Voices rose in Hebrew. Ancient words carried across generations, trembling yet steady. Each phrase was precise, each syllable sharp. The language was old, older than most who spoke could understand, but its power was in rhythm, repetition, and belief. The box responded. The air thickened, pressing down on their chests. The flames of the candles bent inward, drawn toward the cabinet as though pulled by invisible breath. The walls groaned. A low hum vibrated through the floor, growing louder with each prayer, and then objects began to move. At first, small things, papers rustling, a chair shifting slightly, then larger, tables scraping across the floor, books tumbling from shelves, glass shattering in sharp bursts. The salt circle trembled, grain scattering, but the line held. The scent of jasmine grew overwhelming, choking, sweet to the point of sickness. Beneath it came another odor, burning hair. Acrid, unmistakable, it filled their throats, their eyes watering as if the air itself were on fire. One of the descendants faltered, her voice cracking in terror. The man seized her hand, forcing her to continue, his own voice rising, layered, fractured, as though not entirely his own anymore. The prayers grew louder. The box shook violently, its wood groaning, its doors rattling as though something inside clawed to escape. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting across the walls, figures moving though no one stood there. The candles flared, their flames doubling, tripling, casting the room in wild, frantic light. And then came the climax, the final prayer, the words Havila herself had spoken, the incantation meant to bind the Dybbuk once more. The rabbi among them raised his voice, trembling yet firm, reciting the ancient phrase with every ounce of strength his soul could bear. The air roared, the room shook, the box screamed, not with wood, not with hinges, but with something alive, a sound that cut through the marrow of their bones. And just as the last word fell into silence, the cabinet burst open with a deafening crack. When the ritual ended, when the final prayer left trembling lips, the box burst open with a deafening crack that split the silence like thunder. For a moment, the world seemed to shatter. The candles extinguished, the air turned heavy, and the smell of burning hair filled the room until it suffocated every breath. But then, just as suddenly it was over, the Dybbuk box sat motionless. Its doors closed once more, its surface still. The circle of salt, broken and scattered, lay across the floor like ash. For the first time in what felt like forever, silence held. No whispers, no groans, no unnatural sense. Only silence. Those who had taken part in the ritual collapsed in exhaustion, trembling, their voices raw, their faces pale. Yet as they sat in that silence, they felt something they had not dared to hope for in years. Relief. They believed against all odds that it was finished. The Dybbuk was sealed. The prison had held. For days afterward, the box remained quiet. It was placed in storage, locked away under careful watch. The survivors whispered prayers of gratitude, convincing themselves that the suffering had ended. Families embraced again. For the first time, nights passed without screams. And yet, even as relief spread through them like fragile sunlight, something darker waited beneath the surface. It began with the cracks. Tiny at first, hairline fractures that seemed harmless, the kind of imperfections any old wood might bear. But those who had taken part in the ritual saw them, and their relief began to falter. The cracks spread slowly, creeping like veins across the surface, too deliberate, too unnatural to be dismissed. And from them seeped a faint aroma, soft but undeniable, the sweet, suffocating scent of jasmine. The fear returned. And then came the incidents. One of the descendants fell ill without warning, her body wasting away despite medicine and care. Another suffered nightmares so violent, he clawed at his own skin in his sleep, waking with blood beneath his nails. Within weeks, one man died suddenly in his home, his face frozen in terror, his eyes wide open as though he had seen something no living soul should see. It was clear the ritual had not ended the curse. It had only changed it. The Dybbuk was no longer clawing to escape. It was reaching outward, seeping through the cracks, touching those who had dared to bind it once more. The man who had carried the box longest suffered most of all. His mind, already fractured from possession, crumbled further. He no longer slept, too afraid of what waited in the corridors of his dreams. He sat for hours in silence, staring at the box as if it stared back. Visitors found him muttering words in languages he did not know, his eyes vacant, his hands trembling as though something moved through him. When asked what haunted him, he spoke only one phrase: "It breathes when no one is watching." Fear spread among the survivors, and desperation drove them back to the diary. They had studied it before, had followed his instructions, but in their haste, in their terror, they had overlooked the final page. It was there that they found the truth they had ignored, scrawled hastily, written as though by a hand too afraid to finish the thought. The Dybbuk does not die, it only waits. The word struck like a blade. Every ritual, every prayer, every desperate attempt had only delayed the inevitable. The spirit was patient, older than their blood, older than their history. It could wait through lifetimes, through centuries, to the rise and fall of civilizations. It could wait until another hand touched the wood, until another curious soul leaned too close, until the cracks widened enough to breathe again. And now, it was waiting once more. Those who survived carried the curse with them. Some fled to distant towns. Others locked themselves in their homes, but none escaped. Illness followed. Tragedy struck. Families fractured. The box remained silent in its storage, yet its shadow stretched across oceans, across bloodlines, across generations. For months, the storage facility held it under lock and key. Guards were posted, cameras installed, measures taken to ensure it could not be disturbed. Yet fear spread among the staff. They whispered of lights flickering in the halls, of equipment failing without cause. They spoke of shadows moving when no one was near, of the faint scent of jasmine lingering in the air. Some refused to enter the room at all, their instincts warning them of what logic denied. And then one morning it was gone. The doors of the storage room remained locked. The security cameras showed nothing but static during the hours it vanished. No alarms were triggered, no signs of forced entry. The box had simply disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. To this day, no one knows where it went. Some say it was stolen by collectors, drawn by greed and curiosity, blind to the warnings written across history. Others believe it was reclaimed by the spirit itself, hidden now in some forgotten corner of the world, waiting to be found. But the most chilling belief is this: that it has already been found, that it rests quietly in someone's home, mistaken for nothing more than an antique, that its cracks are widening, its breath is stirring, and soon it will begin again. Whispers in dreams, shadows in mirrors, jasmine in the air. The diary's warning echoes still. The Dybbuk does not die. It only waits. And so the curse never ends. It lingers not in the box alone, but in every story told, every frightened whisper, every curious glance that dares to wonder if the legend is true. Perhaps it waits for another hand to claim it. Perhaps it waits for you. The tale of the Dybbuk box fades into silence. Yet the silence feels uneasy, does it not? A box that vanishes without a trace, a curse that does not die but only waits, a spirit that may even now drift closer than we dare to imagine. Perhaps it is buried in dust, forgotten once more. Perhaps it is resting in the home of someone who has no idea what stirs inside their walls. Or perhaps, even as you listen, the story itself has drawn it nearer. For curses are carried not only by hands, but by memory, by breath, by the act of telling. The truth is this: the curse never ends. It moves through generations, through whispers, through those who are curious enough to listen to stories like this one. You too are part of it now, because stories are bridges, and some bridges do not close once crossed. But the unknown fascinates you. If you crave more tales of haunted relics, lost worlds, forbidden lands, and mysteries that linger in the shadows of time, then do not let this be where your journey ends. There are countless stories waiting. Stories as chilling, as painful, as unforgettable as the Dybbuk Box itself. So if this tale has left its mark on you, let it pull you deeper. Like this story, share it with those who dare to follow you into the dark, and leave your thoughts in the comments, because every voice adds another layer to the mystery. And above all, subscribe, so you will never miss the next descent into forgotten corners of history, legend, and shadow. For the Dybbuk Box may be gone, but the world is still full of places and relics where curses breathe, where mysteries ache to be uncovered. The curse never ends, and neither do the stories.